We'll be ready to start. So we had a very, very interesting conversation about the Trump administration and directions of American foreign policy. Very optimistic on the policy content, maybe a few shadows lurking behind in the politics behind it. And I think we'll have more to say about that later in the day. But now we're going to turn the focus to Europe. And if we had a good hour discussion about President Trump, we'll now have another hour discussion about Macron and Merkel and Brexit and nationalism and populism in Europe. And to lead that conversation, I'm delighted to have a friend and colleague, Robin Shepherd. So Robin, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. If everybody could take a seat, that would be very much appreciated. Kurt has called in the B team as Diane has been called away due to or wasn't able to come due to a family emergency. On the panel today, let me just introduce, you all know who they are from the booklets, but just so you know which individual matches up with that title in the booklets and the small notes we have here on the agenda. We have Jamie Kirchick right here on this side. We have the British Ambassador Justin McKenzie Smith sitting to his right. We have Ali Aslan from Germany here, and Benjamin Haddad from France to the right. I'm not going to, we're always caught for time and sessions run over, but I think we have to finish on time. I think Kurt would appreciate that. So I'm not going to talk very much. I'm going to allow the panelists to do the talking and then to bring in people just as you'd like during a informal discussion. We just had an America panel, so it strikes me as a good segue to start with our American panelist, who has just written the optimistically titled book, The End of Europe. And if you think that's bad, the subtitle's even more pessimistic, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. So James, I wonder if you would help set that in a little bit more context, sure. Explain what you were thinking in writing such a book and what your prognosis is for Europe, since our title is Whither, Europe.
Well, I think it's better to be a pessimist, because then you're occasionally pleasantly surprised, whereas if you're an optimist, then you're perpetually disappointed. So that's my general outlook on life. I think on the issue of Europe, most of us were laboring under three major illusions for the past 25 years. The first was that Europe would forever be a place of perpetual peace, that there would never be a continental war of the sort that we had seen in the 20th century, that Europe would be a security exporter into the regions around it. I think on the issue of democracy, there was an assumption that everyone had to come to this consensus that democracy was the best form of government, and that no one would ever stray from that. And the third was economics, that the regulated free market economy was the ideal form of managing our economic life. And I think all three of these assumptions have been rudely overturned in the past several years. Obviously, on the security question, we have a war in Ukraine that is now well into its third year, taken over 10,000 lives. The first annexation of territory on the European continent since World War II, perpetrated under the same exact rationale that Adolf Hitler used for his territorial conquests, which is claiming that your ethnic, linguistic brethren are being oppressed in another country's territory, and therefore you need to annex it. And this obviously has very grave implications for other parts of Europe, including NATO members, where there are large Russian-speaking minorities. And the other security matter that we have is also the refugee crisis, which peaked in 2015, but I don't think that's going away anytime soon, and we may see a repeat of that in the future as long as the periphery of Europe remains unstable. On the question of democracy, we have one country, Hungary, which at this point, if it applied for membership in the European Union, I don't think it would be accepted. That's how bad things have regressed in that country. If you want to talk about state capture in terms of Russia, the influence networks that Russia has within Hungary, in business, in the intelligence communities, in the political sector, the political world, is very alarming. Viktor Orban, shows no signs of moving away from the direction that he's going in, and it seems that Orbanism, as a political ideology, if you want to say, it's clearly being implemented to some extent in Poland, and there are bad signs in the Czech Republic and Slovakia as well. And finally, on economics, we have almost 10 years of very low growth to zero growth in the Eurozone. It's the rise of a left-wing economic populism that questions the fundamentals of the market economy. We see in Greece, a neo-Marxist party has taken the reins of power. We have Podemos in Spain. In France, the Socialist Party has been wiped out, and in terms of the left in that country is now represented by a unreconstructed Marxist who wants to ally France with the Bolivarian Union, or whatever it's called, in Latin America. The Labour Party has been overtaken by an assortment of Trotskyists, Stalinists, and Leninists. There are real serious questions about the economics of Europe, and are we ever going to get out of this zero growth era? To add to this, we now have, as we learned in the last panel, an American president, if not administration, but an American president who is the most anti-European president, perhaps in American history, or certainly in the modern era. Someone who has openly supported Brexit and the disintegration of the EU, who has no appreciation for the values that connect America to Europe, that underlie the transatlantic relationship, and who has a bizarre, still not fully explained affinity for Russia and the man who rules that country. So this puts Europe in a very precarious geopolitical position where it can't really fully rely on the United States in the way that it has in the past. And on the other side, in the East, there is a Russia that is incredibly aggressive. This week, tomorrow I believe actually, we'll be seeing the quadrennial Zapad exercise with an estimated 100,000 Russian soldiers. I believe it's the biggest Russian military exercise since 1981. So this is a very precarious situation that Europe is in. There's hope. If you purchase the book, available at all fine bookstores and Amazon.com, you will find, you will discover I'm not completely pessimistic. There are ways out of this morass, but it's a very difficult picture that we're in.
Just before we come back to Europe, about Europe, I want to stay with America about Europe and just ask one quick follow-up question. In the last panel, perhaps the consensus reading of the last panel was that even if, as one speaker from the floor put it, President Trump is something of a visiting fellow at the Institute of White House Studies, there are people around the president who are highly respected by everybody across the partisan divide in the United States. What does someone like Jim Mattis think about the current state of Europe? What does somebody like Rex Tillerson, what does somebody like H.R. McMaster, these are very significant people in the administration. How do they see what's going on in Europe?
These individuals you've named, with the possible exception of Tillerson, who I'm not fully convinced, has the sort of understanding of the importance of values in American foreign policy. He's a Texas oil man, and I'm not sure that that's really, he understands global business and how that all works. I'm not certain that he has an understanding of the importance of values in American foreign policy, but certainly the other people you've mentioned, obviously Kurt is is in the administration, Wes Mitchell, who hopefully will be the new top diplomat for Europe. It's hard to think of a better person for that job than him. I think the best case scenario is that we basically have a president who doesn't implement the worst case scenario policies that he was talking about, abandoning NATO, abandoning the EU, going into trade war with Germany, who sort of emotes on Twitter occasionally and says some outrageous and offensive things, but the policy will hopefully be normal, will be that of a typical Republican administration. Steve Bannon, who I think was the worst influence on the president, particularly on these issues that we're talking about in terms of populism in Europe. If you look at Breitbart.com and the affinities that they have for Marine Le Pen, for all the various far-right populist movements in Europe, he's out of the White House. That's good news. The globalists have won. The cucks have won a victory over the nationalist wing of the Trump administration. So that's good news. And so I think, we have to distinguish the man and what you think about the particular individual who's president of the United States, his personality, his behavior. I think we have to distinguish our personal feelings about this guy from the fact that there is a vast bureaucracy that controls the levers of American foreign policy. There's a Defense Department, there's a State Department. These are staffed with literally tens of thousands of patriotic Americans who probably don't share the president's views on lots of issues. And, we don't live in a dictatorship where the president just rules by fiat. There are lots of other branches of power. So I think the worst fears that those of us who opposed this president when he was running for president, the worst fears have not been realized. And I would say to everyone to keep that that distinguishment in mind between the personality of the president and the fact that there are many good people around him. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Is this working? Been handed this, so I hope it's working. Now it's working.
Now you have two microphones that are not working.
I heard you, that worked.
This works,
yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much indeed. Let's move now to Europe, about Europe. And I wanted to, first of all, turn to Ali Aslan, who's sitting to my right, from Germany. I wanted to ask you a specific question about Germany since you have elections coming up. But before we get to that, I'd like you to comment on what you've heard there from a friend in the United States who's very much a friend of Europe, but paints a picture of a very precarious situation in Europe. Is that something that you see coming from Germany? Does it look the same way to you, that there are genuine existential problems, not merely superficial problems that can be righted by a bit of tweaking here and there? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, my American friend James, I think much to my regret is right on point, and especially when you were assessing the situation from Germany, from Berlin, where I am based, where it's funny, whenever I go to these conferences, and there's been somewhat of an evolution where you said, I'm from Germany, and people would say, oh, that's nice, Now it's like, I'm from Germany, oh my God, you got to lead, and the evolution and transformation that's I think not just myself, obviously, but all Germans, including Chancellor Merkel, have encountered in the previous years is a bit peculiar, most of all to us Germans, because you have to understand, it wasn't too long ago, I remember in 1999, The Economist actually had a headline, had a title named Germany, the sick man of Europe. I mean, this is only 17, 18 years ago. And due to an unforeseen set of circumstances around the globe, now we find ourselves reluctantly, if I may say, in the driver's seat. Now, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news here in Georgia, but I'm afraid that Germany, at least, that's my personal opinion, obviously, as a political journalist who's covering Berlin and Germany for many years, I think those expectations are a bit too high at this point for Germany for many reasons. Let me point out a couple, and then we can move on. For one, when you talk about Germany, for very obvious reasons, history and the historic context is never far away. The fact that the term leadership doesn't come easily to us, and for all German speakers out there, if you translate the term or the word leader one-to-one into German, you have a problem, where the problem lies. That's one. So leadership in that sense, we tried that a few decades ago, didn't really pan out all that well. Germany, of all countries, I would argue, in the European Union, has an incessant need and desire not to stand out. You know, maybe a bit different than my French counterparts here, but, you know, Germany needs to be a team player.
But hasn't that changed? I mean, obviously we can see incremental change, but hasn't it been a bit more than incremental under Angela Merkel's chancellorship?
Has it? I mean, the expectations have changed, but if you really look at the major crises around the world today, you know, if you talk about Syria, if you talk about the Mideast, if you talk about Yemen, if you talk about North Korea, you know, Germany, and you can argue Europe, is largely absent from the solution making in the context of these problems. Let me just point out another problem that Germany is facing aside from the historic context, which, if you will, leads into it. There's a catch-22 you know, phenomenon that applies to Germany, namely, and Germany's exertion of power in the foreign policy arena. Because if Germany really exerts itself and puts its foot down and leads the direction, as it has done, for instance, during the Euro crisis, you know, it does get a lot of backlash. Oh, here we go again. Here we go again. The Germans are trying to dictate the way. Whereas if we don't lead and we are rather looking for a consensus, then it is us Germans shying away from our responsibility. It's really a very tricky situation, catch-22. Also keep in mind, this is something that Americans might find it hard to understand. The German public, the German population, the German citizens don't want Germany to play a much more assertive role in foreign affairs. And that's normal. If you think about the mentality that we have carried post-World War II, a very pacifist, very leading from behind, checkbook diplomacy, supporting other nations in a concerted effort. You cannot switch on the bait and expect Germans, 80 million Germans overnight, to say, yes, damn it, we're leaders, we're going to lead from now on. That's not how it works. The Kerber Foundation, a very renowned German foundation, as you know, has done a poll, a nationwide poll, and the question was, do you want Germany to take on a more assertive role in foreign affairs? Guess how many people said yes? 37%. You know? Now, I'd be curious to find out how much percent France or US would get, but my understanding and my assumption is that it would be a bit, you know, higher than we've produced. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand it. I mean, look at all these individuals behind me. Of all those, Chancellor Merkel seems to be the only sane one.
She's in the middle.
You know,
that? She's in the middle.
She's in the middle.
She's the sun around which the planets
there you go.
are orbiting.
And I think it's no mistake by the organizers. Now, the one all the way up front, he's still an apprentice. We have to see how he comes along. But she's in the middle. And this is a seat and this is a position that we Germans, post-World War II, find ourselves in for the very first time, wanted from outside. And I have to say, and with that I'll round up, we have an election coming up in less than 2 weeks, and you know you'd be hard pressed to hear any of those two candidates, Chancellor Merkel or Martin Schulz, to really talk extensively about foreign policy. You know, and just gets to show you that certainly we have not inherited and absorbed. We had a TV debate. We only have one in Germany, as opposed to the 3 in the U.S., whereas one focuses particularly on foreign policy in the U.S. That's not how it works in Germany. We have a 90-minute debate once, and in that debate, foreign policy hardly ever came up, let alone Germany's role in world affairs. So, you know, just to give you an idea, I understand that, you know, that Chancellor Merkel is leading with a steady hand, that she seems to be the only one left with sanity in the realm of world politics, at least amongst the influential individuals. But leadership in the sense that Germany will come out, because let's be honest here, if Hillary Clinton had won the debate, and if Great Britain had opted to stay in the EU, we would not have this discussion about German leadership right now. You know, but as it is, Trump is in the White House. Great Britain has opted to leave. Macron, we still have to see, very new in the driver's seat. You know, so by default, you know, everybody's looking towards Berlin. But those are expectations that at least in the year 2017, you know, Germany will find itself very hard pressed, if not reluctant, to fulfill.
And just very briefly, and we'll move on to France, you mentioned the election. It looks for all the world that Angela Merkel is going to win. However, you may have remembered that Theresa May called a snap election, and she was going to get 150 seat majority or goodness knows what, and she ended up actually falling flat on her face. She didn't go down, but she landed flat on her face. Are we right to assume that Angela Merkel is actually going to retain the chancellorship?
Well, I would argue that the German polling is a bit more reliable than American and UK polling, apparently. You know, no, I mean, look, all joking aside, it has to be a semi-miracle for Chancellor Merkel not to get her fourth term. Not just because the numbers are there; she's leading by a very wide margin, but because, you know, as in Germany, you actually have to enter into two or sometimes even three-way coalitions to lead. And I don't see any scenario, I don't foresee any scenario for Martin Schulz, a former president of the EU Parliament, to come up with a scenario. He is, you know, it surprises me because this is a man who does not lack experience. This is a man who does not lack eloquence. This is not a man who lacks knowledge, Martin Schulz that is. But this has not transformed him for him to become a very effective candidate. So the real interesting question in Germany right now for me is not whether Chancellor Merkel is going to get a fourth term, because that seems to be somewhat of a foregone conclusion when you look at the numbers, but rather what are the other parties doing, particularly the AfD. You know, this is a party that for the very first time since post-World War II, Germany might find itself having a far-right xenophobic party sitting in the German Bundestag, in the German parliament. And I'm not saying they're just going to nudge by. This is not a party that barely crosses the 5% threshold. Looking at the polls today, they stand at 11 and 12%. And that, of course, has a lot to do with the refugee crisis that we have, the refugee situation as such, where Germany has taken in 1 million people in 2015, but also all the symptoms that we've talked about today that led to Donald Trump, that led to Brexit. Make no mistake about it. They exist in Germany as well. There are a lot of people who don't feel represented anymore. There are a lot of people who feel excluded from the process. So yes, you can argue all day long that German unemployment is at its lowest in 20 years, that our experts are wanted and desired all around the world, that Germany is strong and respected. All of those are true on paper, you know, but the AfD has managed to get into get into 10-11 consecutive German state elections. They have managed to get into parliament, sometimes with as much as 20%. So it shows you there's a huge potential. There's a, strike the term huge, but there's a potential in Germany for that you know, is not immune to this global virus, as I call it, of disillusioned citizens who are looking for an alternative.
Right. Thank you very much. And let's move now on to France. We used to talk about, it seems quite a long time ago now, the Franco-German axis. And then France kind of drops out of the axis. And I don't know whether you can have an axis with only one person holding it up. But Macron has at least made noises about bringing France right back up to the forefront of the European table. Is that something that we can count on?
Yeah, look, you know, I think Macron's election is an interesting signal for Europe for different reasons. First, obviously, you know, France is one of the two main military powers in Europe. It's one of the three main economic powers. So the fact that he won rather than, say, Marine Le Pen, of course, is obviously good news for Europe. Marine Le Pen winning the presidential election would have been much more dramatic for the EU than Brexit. The UK always had sort of an awkward relationship with the European Union that France doesn't have as a founding member. It's a key member of the Eurozone. But I would say, I think what Europe has been going through in the last few years, I agree with a lot of Jamie's points on the end of Europe, but I think it's mostly the end of Europe as a project to overcome politics, to sort of overcome the notions of identity, of borders, of power, try to deal with political issues through the realm of bureaucracy and technocracy. And what the different crises and the rise of populists have brought to Europe is sort of politics is back. the fact that we have to debate identity, we have to ground our discourse in values and ideology is back in the political realm of European politics.
And does Macron have to pay attention to the Marine Le Pen constituency?
Well,
or can he simply say, I won, and move on, ignoring it largely?
But precisely what I find interesting in the way he ran his campaign and the way he's also trying today to develop a presidential discourse is that I think he's the first liberal pro-European politician who has really shaped his message as a response, as a political response to the rise of populists, for a couple of reasons. First, he ran a fairly populist campaign. Not populist in terms of extremist political ideas. He stayed grounded to the center, is liberal, pro-European, reformist. But he did run a very anti-establishment campaign. Created his own party from scratch a year ago, ran completely new candidates at the parliamentary elections. So really ran, in a way like Trump did, against the failures of both establishment incumbent political parties, the Republican and the Socialist, and all but destroyed the Socialist Party in that respect. But he also ran, I think, a very ideological campaign, which I think is interesting. If you look at the Brexit campaign, and I heard Macron make this case himself during the presidential campaign. If you look at Brexit, on the one side you had the Remainers who were making a shy, sort of defensive, technocratic cost-benefit case for staying in the European Union, saying, well, we got a good deal from the European Union, you know, it's better if we stay within the single market, even though obviously no one's a fan of the EU here. On the other side, the Brexiteers were making a value-based, identity-based case for independence. There's no way you can win an election against that. And I think the way he shaped his message, you had European flags flying at the rallies. It was very counterintuitive because any regular pollster would have told you, well, you have this rise of Euroscepticism all over Europe. You have to be very cautious when you address this. And on the contrary, he was actually very offensive, very proactive, talking about a pro-European message and a liberal message. And I think that's key. When I talk about politics being back, if you look at the crisis that Europe has been going through in the last few years, the Euro crisis, the refugee crisis, Ukraine, none of they really show the limits of what technical decision-making is confronted to, because the Euro crisis is about, do you want to save Greece? Do you consider that you have a sense of solidarity to Greece, where its political leadership lied for years about its accounting, but still you consider you're part of the same political organization, you have to save them? The refugee crisis is also, completely about what kind of society you want to live in, what kind of, how do we define our identity? This is not something that just, can be instruments driven. It's the same thing for Ukraine. Do you consider that it is a challenge on the European security order, on the liberal world order? And for all the backlash that EU bureaucrats have faced over the last few years, I mean, they're doing their job. The problem was the complete lack of political leadership. So the question now is, can we bring this political leadership at the European level? Can we challenge populists on their own ground, on their own field, by bringing issues of identities and borders and defense and security at the European level to show the European citizens that they can be protected by the European Union, that actually the European Union is an organization is a political organization that can protect them. And on this, I would say I'm fairly optimistic, because I do think, coming back to your question, you do have a combination of Macron and Angela Merkel, who I think will feel much freer in a fourth term. And, we see this already. Obviously, there's a lot of campaign rhetoric from her. But in the last few days, she's already said that she wanted to really ask once and for all the question of Turkey's bid to the European Union at the October EU Council. And I think that is really key to define whether the European Union wants to set its own borders, wants to, say, okay, now we're done. We consider that Turkey is not part of the European sphere, which is what most European citizens believe. She also wants to raise the issue of Hungary at the next council, and really confront once and for all Orban and the populist challenge that he's confronting the Europeans with. I think you see the same move on defense. Last year, 17 countries of the European Union either increased defense spending or at least froze decrease in defense spending. And in this respect, by the way, coming back to what was said in the previous panel, I have a little contrarian take on the Trump administration on this. I think it's an incredible opportunity for Europeans to finally get their act together. I think Trump is saying out loud what a lot of the American policymakers were sort of hinting at in the last few years about the fact that Americans will not always be there for Europeans, that there's growing dissatisfaction, especially in American public opinion, over the decrease in defense spending, over the idea that allies are free riding. So it's really confronting Europeans with the necessity to unite and get their act together. So, I think Macron's election, Merkel's re-election will probably, hopefully open a formidable window of opportunity to really bring back political leadership in Europe.
Benjamin, thank you very much. I now want to turn to the UK, and we have the British ambassador with us to talk about a couple of broad issues, and also perhaps to talk a little bit about how Britain views Georgia, since that's the one country we haven't mentioned so far on this panel. One of the things living in Washington, D.C., that I have not tired of, and I will never be allowed to tire of explaining to American friends, is that Britain, even though there was obviously, and we talked about this a little on the panel yesterday about populism, the Brexit movement, as it were, there was certainly populist aspects to it. Clearly, the UKIP party, Nigel Farage, this was a populist party. But in the same vein that I was saying yesterday, you can't simply slap a negative label on everything you don't like. Brexit is not a populist movement. It's been driven straight through the centre ground of the most established political party in Europe, the British Conservative Party. And one of the things that the British government, which is leading Brexit, has been at pains to point out, Liam Fox, who comes to the Halifax Forum, many years he's come to Halifax Forum, never tires of saying, is that we are leaving Europe, the European Union, we are not leaving Europe. Europe and the European Union are not the same thing. The British government persistently points out that Britain spends 0.2% of its GDP on defence, 0.7% on foreign aid. It is an internationalist movement. That is the way it is characterized and pushed by the British government. Whether the British government succeeds in that aim is another matter. But that is how it is characterized. Now, I'm not a member of the Foreign Office, and therefore these are personal opinions, but we do have someone who is from the British Foreign Office and can explain what it actually means to Europe, and perhaps also to Georgia, as the President said yesterday, as part of Eastern Europe. What does Brexit actually mean to Europe, and then specifically to this country?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Robin. You've just stolen all my best lines. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you to McCain and EPRC for inviting me onto this panel. I must say, when I was first invited a few weeks ago, I hope Nino Yevgenidze will forgive me, but the draft working title for this session was France and Germany, where is Europe going? And I was very flattered to be asked to be on the panel, but I wondered if there were other of my colleagues who would be more appropriate. But Nino found a great fix for that by changing the title to France, Germany, UK, where is Europe going? There is a slightly more serious or symbolic part to that technical fix to the title of this session, because as you said, Robin, we're talking about Europe. As part of that, we're obviously talking about the European Union, but we're talking about Europe, and Britain, having chosen to leave the EU, is in no sense, could not leave Europe. We are a European nation. We are a European nation culturally, historically, in terms of our perspective, in so many different ways, and that will remain the case. It's making the best of the very best of the decision that was taken by the British people in 2016 is an enormously complex, challenging process. No one is pretending it's otherwise. The time pressure is extreme. The time pressure is extreme. There are huge unanswered questions which we are working through within Britain, but also in our negotiations with the EU 27. But to come back to your point, Robin, would Britain necessarily take a different decision now if the question was asked again 14, 15, 16 months later? I'm not sure it would. I'm not sure it would. And I think you made a very important point that you have to have a perspective of the whole of British society, or the whole of the British nation. The decision was not necessarily only made by people like us or in a forum like this. It was made by the whole of society. And as I say, I think if you came back with that same question now for a variety of reasons, I'm not sure you would get a different answer. I think you might get the same answer. A lot of what is being worked through at the moment is about our issues of citizenship, issues of the Northern Ireland border, in due course issues of trade, which are extremely critically important and fascinating, but probably not for discussion now. And I'm a serving diplomat, and I probably shouldn't go into that territory right now. What is, I think, more immediately relevant is what it means about Britain's foreign policy stance, our stance on defence, security, and development as well. And that, in a way, brings me back to where you encouraged me to start, which was, leaving the European Union, not leaving Europe. Leaving the European Union, not leaving NATO. Leaving the European Union, not leaving the UN Security Council, and so on, and so on, and so on. So the point about that argument, I think, is really just to get across that by nature, by definition, by default, Britain will remain not only active in Europe, but globally active. And I'm absolutely clear about that. You mentioned our long-term commitments on defence spending, primarily focused on European defence, of course. You mentioned our commitment to international development, and that is, part of British legislation and will remain so. Point one. Point two, it's also in Britain's interests to have a very strong European Union as a foreign policy and defence actor in Europe. It could not be otherwise. It could not be otherwise. We have been part of many of the significant successes of the European Union in foreign and defence policy. I'm thinking about Iran policy. I'm thinking about tentative progress in the Western Balkans, and of course our policy on Russia as well. And that leads me to my third point, which is, therefore, again, by definition, it will make sense once the UK leaves the European Union to develop a very deep, very comprehensive partnership with the EU on foreign and defence policy. And I don't think that will be controversial. There's lots of other issues in the Brexit debate that are intensely controversial. But I don't see the downside of a very close, very pragmatic partnership between the UK, the EU, and individual EU member states on foreign and defence policy.
And speaking, since you are the British ambassador to Georgia, since the vote was taken, this might be actually a useful and instructive illustration. Have your instructions changed from London? Has London said, oh, we've had Brexit now, so the policy to Georgia is now completely different?
No, it's a fair question. It's a fair question. Can I illustrate it with a slightly, it might seem a slightly obscure example, but it's an important one, and it will get to my point, which is last Tuesday we hosted a farewell reception at the British Embassy across the road here for this year's batch of young Georgians who are travelling to the UK on UK scholarships for master's degrees. And we were joined at that reception by lots of the alumni, young Georgians who have studied in the UK. I think there were about 150 people there, 150 Georgians, young Georgians, mostly, I would say, between, let's say, 21, 22, those who are going this year, and then maybe 30, 35, those who have returned in the past. I think if I had said to any of those young Georgians, this aspiration to EU membership, you don't really mean it, do you? You don't really mean it. I think the response would have been very blunt and very direct. EU membership, we might talk about that, has lots of challenges to it in the EU today, but the UK continues to support that aspiration. But why? Because it's an aspiration to European values. It's an aspiration to European values. And that goes beyond the question of actual membership of the organization to which direction is this country going in. So, of course, 100%, Britain is and will continue to support that aspiration of Georgia to be, part of the European family, as we heard yesterday from the Prime Minister and the President.
Well, I mean, and it's interesting, we started off with the American perspective on Europe. The United States is not part of the European Union, Canada is not part of the European Union, and yet can be totally in favour of people's aspirations to join it, even outside of being a member. So there's no contradiction in that, and there's no reason why British policy changes at all in that respect.
On the question of principle, no. On the question of practice, I hope not either. I hope not either. Those of you who are familiar with Georgia and the EU's presence in Georgia will know that a very important dimension of EU presence here is the EU monitoring mission, which was put in place in 2008 after the war with Russia. A CSDP mission, and I'm very proud that the UK has been an active part of that mission since then. I hope, and the British government put out a paper yesterday on our future relationship with the EU in foreign policy, and that paper makes clear that we hope it will be possible to foresee a new kind of partnership where the UK could continue to be part of exactly those kinds of missions as a partner with the European Union.
Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes left, maybe 20 minutes if we're allowed to spill over into the lunch break for a few minutes. I'd like to bring in members of the audience. So if anybody, if people have microphones, people want to put their hand up. There's a gentleman in the red sweater there, and then there's a lady in, I think, let me stand up, in blue, very beautiful shade of blue over there.
Well, good afternoon as well. Again, I'm Bacho, Senior Kennedy School of Government and Practical Political School of Georgian Institute of Public Affairs. Well, Chancellor Merkel outscored that sometimes the position of one single country could be overruled by aliens. And what do you think? Maybe for that kind of hard lines, Central and Eastern European countries moved away from Western states in a number of outlooks, like they were all in solidarity to reject mandatory migration quotas. And to the speaker to the far left, Mr. Speaker, did you stress in your presentation, in the beginning of your presentation, that there will be no war on European soil in the 21st century? Just to clarify.
There is a war going on European soil.
No, not right now, but I mean in the 21st century.
There's a war in Ukraine that's on European soil. It's taken 10,000 lives, and I would say we should not rule out another conflict. That's the point of what I'm talking about. I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that there could be an attack on a NATO country. I don't think that that's something that we should just assume will never happen. But for the first part of your question, getting back to Germany, there's a very selective German approach to this notion of solidarity and being a team player. And I think the Germans often comfort themselves in claiming that they're always good team players. If you look at the issue of Nord Stream and the whole energy relationship with Russia, Germany is not a very good friend to its European Union and NATO allies in the Baltic states and Poland when it comes to this question. They're very willing to put their own selfish national perceived economic interests before that of EU solidarity. If you look at Libya, where Germany did not go along with its allies in NATO to protect the civilian population of Libya. So I think there's this. The Germans can be good at saying one thing when it comes to the issue of not wanting to be apart from their allies in the Western community, but they can often behave selfishly as well.
Thanks. I haven't forgotten the lady in blue. Ali, do you want to just make a point about the migration aspect of the question, and perhaps
absolutely. Thank you for your question, because there's no way to sugarcoat it. There is disappointment on the part of Germany and Germans to see particularly so many Eastern European nations refusing to share in the burden when it comes to distributing the refugees that we've been harboring now for almost a couple of years now. And to be honest, and let me be blunt, I think the behavior on the part of some Eastern European states who use or seem to be thinking that the European Union is an ATM machine where you just withdraw but you never cash in. I think that's rather troubling. I mean, if you look at and Chancellor Merkel in that regard might have been a bit naive to think that there's going to be a European effort and solution once the refugees are in there. But let me point out, I mean, if we want to talk about European Union, solidarity among 28 and soon to be 27 nations is essential and key. And if you have countries like Hungary and leaders like Viktor Orban who have even declared that they will dismiss any decision by the European Court of Justice that Hungary must share in the burden, that really sets a bad example for the time ahead. But
isn't that precisely at that point? Isn't this where Europe potentially runs into the very serious problems that James has been describing and describes in his book? And at some point, either Germany and the other major powers in the European Union just acquiesce, or they have to go in for one hell of a fight and risk the fact that you get fragmentation and not just Brexit, but Herexit, whatever Hungary might be. That's what they're frightened of. They won't enforce this because they're frightened of the consequences, are they not?
Right. But at the end of the day, I mean, the EU will only continue to exist in its current shape or form and will be able to have that same influence if it stays together in a concerted effort. And right now, and James is correct, of course, in pointing it out, it's not. I mean, if any of these countries, including Germany, in the 21st century, think they can go it alone and have their voices heard in the sphere of world affairs, they are lunatics. I mean, in this day and age where you have the US, you have China, you have India, very ambitious India, you have Indonesia coming, you have Brazil, you have Nigeria. If you really think that, any European nation on its own will have any type and any sort of influence within world affairs to move things, they're delirious, and I'm afraid Great Britain is going to find out the hard way, very soon. I mean, this is a country who thought, at least some portions of its society thought it can go it alone and be better off. Well, we will have to see how much influence Great Britain can exert come March 2019.
Yeah, well, I think time will tell, 10 years will tell. Perhaps the ambassador wants to come in. But just whilst we're on the subject, because migration is an enormously important issue in France as well. Did you want to address that, or did you want to come in on something else?
Yeah, just on the issue of migration, I think at heart you have a deeper misunderstanding between Western and Eastern European countries. And the reason why Western European nations founded the European Union was to put an end to what they saw as the causes of World War II, nationalism, racism, violence between nation states, borders, etc. The Eastern European experience is extremely different. And I think the reason why they joined the European Union is paradoxically precisely the opposite, to protect their sovereignty, to protect their culture, to protect their independence after having been behind the Iron Curtain. And I think maybe the Germans and the French don't do a very good job at understanding, I think, these extremely different perspectives. I'm not personally, I personally feel much more supportive of Merkel and Macron's views on refugee policies, but I'm not sure that's the right issue to confront countries like Hungary and Poland on. If you look at the polls, there was a referendum in Hungary about this. You do have widespread opposition to refugee reallocation. I think when you look at the backlash against NGOs in Hungary or the attempt to politicize the Supreme Court in Poland. These are, I think, much more troubling for the future of the European Union as an organization that defends the rule of law and liberal democracy, and they should be confronted on this. But I think on refugees you have deeper cultural differences.
Thank you. I'm going to take 3 questions at once here, and then we'll come back to the panel. If there's any time after that, I'll happily bring others, but I can just take 3 now. The lady there, please. Not yet.
Hello? Yes. Leila Abdushelishvili, professor of several universities, teaching subjects like political communication, business communication, and strategic communication, among others. Worked for British Council for 10 years on the issues of it, and my main question lies in the following. Speaking of the 2016 elections, from the perspective of you, the Europeans, the way Trump and others, especially Trump, used the language, the way he used the rhetoric patterns, which were simple, insulting at times, using a lot of jargon, fun-making, even his body language resembled not that of being a person of that caliber. Help us, please, how to use this as an example, as a sample for concluding that this is the way the communication of that level has to be run. Did he try to change something? Or was it just his way of dealing as it happens in business sometimes? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I'll take the 2 other questions. There's a gentleman behind there.
Thank you. You have not talked about much about Macron, and he's a revolutionary force in France, I think, and he's the only one in the major countries who really demolished, the mainstream parties, both on the left and on the right. And so many people say that he's a responsible leader, true leader, but others say also that he's an empty shell. He's a kind of a controversial person. He has been on the leftist government, bench, and now he's promoting more, liberal, right-leaning policies. Well, my question would be this. Is he a hope for Europe, and can he, together with Merkel, resurrect the tandem of Germany and France and bring Europe out of the crisis? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the first question is probably something for Jamie, the second one probably for Benjamin. Alina, please. Yeah, please, yeah. Sure.
Thank you. Alina Poyakova, Atlantic Council. I think one of the unintended consequences of Brexit for continental Europe has been that shored up support for the EU in a way that many had not expected to see, given declining support for the EU since the economic crisis. But my question to you, I guess Ben and Ali as well, and France and Germany, Ben, you mentioned that part of Macron's campaign was to try to sell the vision of the European Union as kind of the institution, the protector of French citizens. Do you think, since we've seen that that support for the EU is very thin and actually very weak across Europe, that this is something that might backfire on him eventually, because people will never actually identify with the EU, and the polls do show that really consistently over time. They may like the EU, but they don't identify with it. And then similar question, I guess, for Germany. What if there's another, God forbid, major terrorist attack? Will Germans actually rally around the EU in a moment of crisis, or will that support drop out? And I know right now there's a moment where it's rising again, but do you see kind of sustained increasing support for the EU in Germany going forward?
Thank you very much. We have questions which relate very much to France and Germany and also to the United States. I'm going to start, first of all, with Britain and ask a question which I think is implicit in a couple of the remarks that have just been made, but it might just be me imagining a question that I desperately want answered myself. In international relations, we became used to, particularly over the Iran sanctions issue, we talked about the permanent 5+1. And that you could have scenarios, you have the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, +1 being Germany. I wonder whether, I appreciate this is an immensely sensitive subject, but I wonder whether you could mull over at least, without telling me what the British government, you'd have to be psychic as well, because I think they don't necessarily have a clear policy yet. Is this, for European foreign policy in the world, is a 27+1 formula where Britain actually works very closely with European partners, despite all the fluff and all the emotion, actually it ends up looking fairly similar to the outside world, to what it does as members of the European Union in terms of foreign policy. Is that a scenario which is fantastical, or is it something that a few years from now we might think, that actually is something that is reasonably workable as a political scenario?
There's what the UK government aspires to, and there's what is agreed with the EU 27. At the moment, I can talk about what the UK government aspires to, and what we hope will be agreed with the EU 27. And as I hope I set out in my remarks, there is a very clear opening offer, if you like, from the British government to have the closest possible relationship with the European Union on foreign and security policy issues. And it makes perfect sense. We have been intimately involved for 40+ years in the development of those foreign and security policy structures. We will continue to bring to it our diplomatic assets, our intelligence assets, our defense and military assets, our counterterrorism assets, etc. It would be a natural partnership. It wouldn't be an exclusive partnership. The UK will continue to have relations with the US and with other key players, as will the EU and individual EU member states. What it looks like externally, I'm not so sure. That's not really for me to say. But in terms of the intention, in terms of the ambition, yes, as was set out yesterday by the British government, that's exactly what we're aiming for.
Thank you very much. We're going to stay in or move into continental Europe, and then we'll conclude where we started with the United States. Benjamin, you were asked specifically, actually, about France. I think it was a fairly similar question to the one I posed to you about, is France going to step up in part of that Franco-German axis? There was also a question from the lady in blue, which, since you've gone through an election campaign with Marine Le Pen, about the rhetoric of political discourse. Perhaps address either or both of those as you see fit, relatively concisely if you can, because lunch is approaching and people are going to get hungry on us. So.
On the question about Macron and Merkel, clearly, for the moment, Macron's priority will be domestic. And the only way he can relaunch the Franco-German couple, Moderator, and the European Union will be by showing first that he's making reforms at home. Right now, he's trying to reform the labor market. We had a major strike yesterday in Paris, and some things don't change. We still have cultural pillars. That's also the only way he can then go to Germany and ask for an effort in terms of integration of the Eurozone, a Minister of Economics for the European Union, more budgetary coordination, financial transfer, all the things that he campaigned on. He needs to show that France is finally making an effort at reforming its structural shortcomings with 10% unemployment, 25% youth unemployment, a very rigid labor market. On the political rhetoric, comparing Trump and Marine Le Pen, I think whatever you think of Trump and his rhetoric, one thing that is sure is that there's a lot of anger in the United States that had been ignored by part of the elite. I don't think he brings the right way to address it. I don't think that economic populism, protectionism, or nativism are the answers, but clearly some of the impacts of globalization, of outsourcing, of the economic transformation in certain regions in the United States had been overlooked in the political conversation for years. They were brought back to the fore by Trump. Whatever you think of the messenger, he did tap into something that now we can't ignore and we clearly have to address. And it's fascinating, by the way, to see the similarities in both the voters' profile and the rhetoric of the leaders that address them in the UK, in France, or in in the United States, for that matter. To come to Alina's point on European identity, basically, because this is what it's about. Well, you could quote. I don't remember who said after the Italian unification in 1860, we've made Italy, now we have to make the Italians. That would be an optimistic way to look at it. But
Bismarck and Germans. I don't know, maybe.
No, that was Italians. But that's also what makes it so original and interesting. The European construction is that it's always going to be a completely innovative political structure where we never get rid of nation states. I don't think that's the purpose. The true federalists are a really small minority, mostly seen in the hallways of the European Commission. But unless in the very long term, I don't think they will win. It's not about making the new United States of Europe. You're always going to have two levels where we try to bring at the European level what makes sense, what can protect European citizens. I think on economics or defense, it makes a lot of sense to find synergies and deeper integration at the European level. But if you look at the polls you were referring to, one just quick point I would make is I don't like the term Eurosceptic that has really imposed in the conversation in the last few years, because I think the parties like UKIP or the National Front, they're not Eurosceptic, they're anti-European. They want to dismantle the European Union and go back to national borders. I think most people are Eurosceptic. Most people think that intellectually it could make sense, it's interesting, but it doesn't really work. And when you look at issues like the refugees, I think the major backlash doesn't come from the fact that people disagree with what the European Union is doing, but they have the sense that no one's in charge, and the European Union is not doing anything. We have seen coming, there were so many articles and reports, there's a refugee crisis for years, and we had to wait for thousands of deaths in the Mediterranean and basically millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people crossing the border to finally act. So if you show that the European Union can be in charge and you can find political leadership to address these issues, I think you will dramatically reduce the number of people who don't relate to the European Union and who are what we call Eurosceptics, true Eurosceptics.
Ben, thanks very much. Ali, a few closing remarks, please.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I know lunch is waiting. I think no country, more than Germany, wants Macron to succeed. Germany needs a strong France. This is not a zero-sum game, quite on the contrary. We need a strong France, and the decline of France under Sarkozy and particularly Hollande has been painful for Germany in the sphere of international affairs. Because even in the case of Poland, for instance, a very concrete example, a country that unfortunately has taken somewhat of a wrong turn and is even flirting with the idea of leaving the European Union, for Germany, with its history, to really come down harsh on Poland is a very tricky thing. And this is why we need a strong France. For cases like these in particular, to play good cop, bad cop, if you will, to solve all these internal struggles. So, we very much hope and like for Macron and for France to succeed and become a partner on equal footing again, so we can share the burden together now that Great Britain, unfortunately, is leaving. My final point on Germans' attitude towards Europe. I predict that even if of 28 nations, 27 member states would decide to leave, Germany would be the last one to cling on the European Union. And so no, of course you have amongst 80 million people in Germany, you have many who might not like the way it's gone, the way the euro crisis has been handled. And I'm not even sure amongst 80 million people, you have, many people who actually understands how the EU functions, how it works, how it's, how it's being defined and the players, all that. But at the end of the day, because of its history, because, Germany is incredibly grateful that Europe has given Germany post-World War II another chance and has opened up its arms and brought it back into the family. So for us, if anything, the EU is a rehab center, and even the AfD, and that I find interesting, even the AfD, in the sphere of the political dialogue and election campaign that we're having, we don't have a single party or politician who is anti-Europe. We have segments who are anti-Euro, who don't like the way it's handled and that Germany might be better off without the euro. That we have. But really nobody's proposing, like in France or in other in Holland, in Denmark, we don't really have a politician or a political movement that is proclaiming and supporting Germany leaving the EU. Because I can tell you, you know, when the house breaks down, you know, Germany will still be standing.
James, final remarks, and be aware of the burden of history upon you, that the longer you talk, the longer people have to wait for lunch.
I'm just going to respond to the question.
Absolutely, yeah.
Donald Trump's rhetoric, and I mean, he horrified many of us and continues to with the way he behaves, his language, his comportment. He's not acting presidential. He said during the campaign, believe me, I'll be the most presidential president ever. Clearly that's not happening. I don't think it ever will. And I hope that this, you know, I hope this doesn't represent some guy, you know, ripping off the Band-Aid, and that this is just sort of the new reality that we have to deal with, and that politicians in America are going to increasingly behave like this because that's how they see a ticket to victory. I think that would be a really awful development.
Well, thank you all very much for a terrific discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Benjamin, Ali, James and Justin.